Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. The relationship between the Nigerian police and the general public has mostly been defined by suspicion. And this relationship usually comes under a lot of pressure during civil protests and other forms of civil disobedience. A clear case of this was the high-handedness as displayed by men and officers of the police in recent clashes with members of the Islamic movement of Nigeria in Abuja. Several lives were lost in those situations, lives that could have been saved if a little more preventive steps had been taken. For further commentary on this, we're now being joined still from our Abuja studio by Kabir Adamu, a security professional and managing director of Beacon Consulting Firm Limited, a firm providing enterprise risk and security management solutions in Nigeria. Kabir Adamu, welcome to the morning show.
Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you, Dr. Ruben and Leila. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to have you on the morning show. Quickly, recently, the spokesperson of the Nigeria police assured Nigerians that the police is committed to what he called standard procedure, and he added best practice. This was in the context of complaints about how the police handled the protest by the Islamic movement of Nigeria. Then, of course, subsequently, there was a clash between the police and the members of the Shiite movement, resulting in deaths, gunshot wounds and all of that. Now, we also had yesterday the protest by the members of the Revolution Now movement, where live bullets were fired by the police and other security agents in Lagos, and also reported cases of police brutality in the Federal Capital Territory. What exactly should be the standard procedure? Will you describe what the police did yesterday, for example, as best practice?
Unfortunately, no. Do I doubt the sincerity of purpose by the Inspector General of Police? No. But the reality is what we are seeing on the ground. You mentioned the activities of the Islamic movement in Nigeria and how the police responded. You gave the example of the Revolution Now movement and what we saw yesterday in Lagos. Even though I must say with a word of caution, that issue has not been investigated properly, so there are no evidence that there was live bullets used. Yes, some people said they had, sound of gunshot, but nobody actually came up with facts to support that. So having said that, what are best practices in managing protest or crowd action like the types that we are seeing recently in Nigeria? The number one rule is minimum force. It is only when the life of the security personnel is threatened, then he is allowed to protect himself. Even then, the question is what equipment does he have at his disposal? In managing crowds or riotous situations like the types that we're seeing recently in the country, there are basic equipment that each police should have. As an example, you have protective gear, you have stun guns in some instances, you have water cannons, and things like that. So the problem or the challenge with us in Nigeria is that unfortunately this type of equipment is not available for the police force. Even where they have them, the numbers are so inadequate that using them with the kind of numbers we've seen coming out, in the case of the Islamic movement in Nigeria, 1,000 sometimes, 3,000, we've seen that, or in the case of the Revolution Now in Lagos. So that has been the main issue in Nigeria. While the leadership of the police seems to have that commitment, unfortunately, the reality is that the equipment at the disposal of the police does not allow them to use that kind of minimum force. The reality is that what they go out on the street with are sometimes, in the rare cases, tear gas, and then, of course, guns with live ammunition. And in desperate instances, the police is forced to use that. The second part, which for me is even the most important part, is the training. What kind of training have these police been given to allow them to manage such situations? the department of the police that is meant to manage that is mobile police. And you and I know that that particular department is being sought after by, people who have the money to pay. And they are being deployed to banks, they are being deployed to, for close protection response duties for people who can pay for it. Unfortunately, they do not have enough personnel in that unit to handle the kind of situations that we saw yesterday in Lagos. So that brings us to the next point, which is the resources in terms of manpower, the availability of the leadership of the police. So all of these issues together, I think, create the kind of circumstances that we have in Nigeria. In terms of best practices and international standard, what we saw yesterday, unfortunately, falls very short of international standard.
It certainly does, sir. And in the face of civil unrest and at a time where groups like the Shiites are starting to feel like a high level of injustices are coming towards them, what can be done at this point in time to stop us from falling into a state of anarchy? Because many people in the public, many citizens believe that the state of security in Nigeria has not been this bad in recent times. And this is the worst that people have compared it to, quote unquote, the Abacha days, for example. So what do we need to do now to stop Nigeria from falling into a state of anarchy?
Let me start with the media. And with due respect, I'm sitting in front of media. I'm being anchored by media personalities. The media needs to understand and disaggregate the issues. I listen, I read a lot of hate messaging in several media outlets, both print, electronic, and unfortunately the social media. And for me, that is the root cause of this problem. Our national unity has been abused to the extent that hate messaging is accepted. If as a recognized print media, you can publish articles that are clearly in the realm of hate messaging, then frankly, that's not acceptable. So I think let's start from that. Let the media learn to disaggregate the issues and call them what they are. If a criminal is carrying out a criminal action, he should be called a criminal. And I think that ethnic profiling and association of ethnicity or religion with certain criminal activities should be abused, because what that does is that it leads to further profiling, and unfortunately it allows the bad element to continue his action while we focus on debate around the profile or the ethnicity of the person. The second element, which I must emphasize, is our leadership. Governance needs to improve, and governance is about equity, it's about justice, it's about fairness. So if all the three levels of government, as well as the branches of government, can embrace this aspect, and I think it will help us a lot. The third element, which is also very important, is tolerance and diversity. We are a member of the International Committee of Nations, and the current focus of all developed countries around the world is on equity, diversity, and tolerance. Unfortunately, we seem to be retrogressing. When you give a quick notice to certain part of the country to leave, that's not what you do in this age and era. Engagement, the whole tenets of democracy, which is revolves around the concept of engagement and empowerment, and reducing the feeling and perception of marginalization between various segments of society. I think that's the way to go. Then the fourth one, which I would say is principally lies with the security agencies, and in this regard, the various arms of government needs to play a role. We expect so much of the security agencies. We started this discussion by identifying the failure of the police to meet international standards. But have we asked ourselves, what kind of training have we allowed the security agencies to receive? So to that extent, I would recommend as early as possible the introduction of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms within the security agencies. When last did we check the training manual of these security agencies? Are we sure the training manual is in tandem with our current democratic dispensation, because for God's sake, some of these training manuals are coming from the 1960s. They've not been updated to reflect our current requirement. The average policeman on the street is living by the dictates of our current national security strategy, which talks about deterrence and sometimes offensive mechanisms. But the current discussion around the world is around engagement. You need to understand that these are your citizens, and you cannot use the kind of force that we saw yesterday on TV being used on citizens. So to that extent, even the media needs to help. The civil society organizations, I had some very learned elder statesmen, such as Femi Falana, speaking and criticizing the security agencies, and I agree totally. But have we asked the next question, how have we helped in terms of recommending changes that would help them move to that level? It's good to criticize, but also put forward recommendations, and not only that, dedicate time to assist the security agencies. So that's really critical as number 4. And then finally, our elder statesmen, really, we need to speak the language of togetherness and federalism. I think, unfortunately, tied to my first point, which is around our failing national unity, this last point is also very important.
Well, Kabir Adamu, brilliant points about what can be done, options that are available to us. But beyond police management of crowd or riotous situations, what do you think is the big missing link in managing national security? The Nigerian government at the moment appears to be totally overwhelmed. Apart from Boko Haram, you have other challenges, kidnapping, all kinds of crises. And government talks about strategy all the time. Security chiefs talk about security architecture, which has become a notorious phrase in Nigeria. We'll take a short break, and then when we come back, you can address this question. Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us is Kabir Adamu, a security professional and managing director of Beacon Consulting Limited. Now, Kabir Adamu, before we went on break, I'd asked you, what in your view makes the security situation in Nigeria so intractable and the government seemingly overwhelmed beyond some of those issues about training and human resources and other things that you have identified at a national level?
So there are 3 levels of, planning, the policy, strategic, and then the operational level. At the policy level, I would say we have an old and not very functional policy document for security. In the course of my discussion earlier on, I talked about our national security policy, which unfortunately needs to be reviewed. And that, I would say, principally is the function of the National Assembly. Of course, to an extent, the support of the executive arm of government, since all the agencies are under the executive arm of government. If you recall, most of the intelligence agencies were created during the military era. At what point did we sit down to review the policy document creating those intelligence agencies? What was the objective of creating them at that time? The simple answer is regime protection. And if till today, that document, that policy, still says regime protection, that's what the leadership of those organizations would do. So that, I would say, is the beginning point. The second point is the strategy itself. And here, I think the missing link is coordination. Currently, the coordination function lies in about 3 places. The Office of the National Security Advisor is the obvious answer. If you ask anyone who knows security in the country, will give you. But then what powers does that office have? Even the name says it's an advisor. Then, of course, the Ministry of Interior, to an extent, the Minister or the PAMSEC, as the case may be, has some coordinating elements because some of the agencies are under him. And then even the presidency, the SGF, and to an extent, has some of those powers. And so that gray and not very cohesive, strategy document does not allow for proper coordination. So I would say that that's another area to look closely at. America suffered greatly from this incoherent coordination element within their security strategy when 9/11 happened. And then they created the Homeland Security Department and made some other changes within their security system to address this element that I mentioned of no coordination. So must we wait till ours reach that point before we do? No. I think this is the time to look closely at the coordination element, the missing coordination element within our national security strategy, and then correct it immediately. We've relied in the past on the charisma of the person of the national security advisor to take care of that missing link. So if you appoint a very charismatic national security advisor, he's able to deal with that. And then if you appoint one that does not have the kind of powers that are necessary, then you have the kind of challenge that you have. And what are the challenges? The security agencies are operating in silos. There is no synergy of function between them. We do not have an intelligence fusion center. So name them. So many elements that come under this absence of coordination. And then, of course, lastly, in the operational level. I've spoken about them earlier, but I'll quickly recount them. Equipment, training, and then, of course, even the ethos with which the personnel do their work. Do they understand that the protection of the life of the Nigerian should be their primary responsibility, or do they have other interests that they are serving? So in a nutshell, these are, I think, at the 3 level, that's why we see what we see today. It's not specific to this government. These are issues that have arisen over time. Of course, they are rearing their head at this time of our national history for several other reasons, which perhaps we can discuss at some other time.
Absolutely, and several ideas have been put forward, several ideas have been championed in terms of adding or contributing to the so-called security architecture of Nigeria. One of the greatest of those ideas is that of state or community policing. This is something that has been at the forefront of discussions across all arms of government for quite a while. And I would like to know your thoughts, sir, on state policing and community policing. Do you believe that this is something that this government needs to adhere to immediately? Do you believe that this is a great provision to the solution of insecurity in Nigeria? Or what are your thoughts in general, anyway, on this matter of state policing?
So the two issues are different, state policing and community policing. For a lot of reasons, I'm not supportive of state policing at this moment. I think our democratic culture has not developed to that point where state policing would actually help the federating units that currently. I think unless and until we have a very sound democratic culture where the legislature at the state level is able to check the state governors, then frankly, state policing shouldn't be an option. If we empower, especially the media and civil society organizations, we focus on at the state level and find ways to empower and enhance the legislative function at state level, then we can start discussing about state policing. For community policing, I'm fully behind it. It is a philosophy that seeks to change the way the police do their work. In other words, take the control of the policing function from the top down approach that we currently have to a down top approach where you and I as citizens are able to identify the issues that affect us and then engage the police and then work with the police to agree a method to solve those problems. I'm very supportive of that. I'm not supportive of the model that the police has tried in about 18 states, if I'm right, and all they did was just to create a department which they call the community policing department. That is not what community policing is. Like I said, it's a philosophy that seeks to change the whole manner with which policing is being done. So if that is what is being envisaged, and I've seen the policy document recommendation by the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, which the president has asked to be brought up as a white paper for his endorsement. I think that's the way to go. I'm happy with some of the language I'm hearing from the current Inspector General of Police on community policing. That's the way to go. So as long as this is what we're talking about, and as long as we're doing it with the frame of mind that it's going to be a philosophical change within the policing rule in Nigeria to make that policing rule bottom up, then I'm supportive of it.
Kabir Adamu, I mean, you've referred more than twice to the Revolution Now protests currently ongoing in Nigeria in terms of how the police try to manage the crowd or failed to manage the crowd, particularly in Lagos yesterday. Well, I would like to have your thoughts on the idea of the protest itself. Government is saying that this amounts to treason for anybody to talk about revolution now in Nigeria. And as a result of that, we've seen some of the steps that have been taken. Do you think that government is overreacting and that, the protests really do not pose any serious threat to national security to the extent that government will be talking about treason?
Dr. Ruben, as far as I know, I do not have any other country but Nigeria. I've had the opportunity to live abroad. I decided to come back to Nigeria. I love my country, and I would hopefully like to see it, develop and grow. Am I happy with some of the governance challenges that we have? No, I'm not happy. Do we need to change those governance challenges? Yes. Is the way and manner that the convener of the revolution now attempted to do, is it the way to go? Is that what I want to teach my kids to do growing up? The answer is no. I do not think any young man in his right senses will put out the kind of message that the convener of that message did. Yes, we agree with him, the challenges he has identified, but why in God's name would he associate the action he wants to do with a revolution and then even go out to call for an attempt to bring down the government? I think that is very confrontational. Yes, I'm supportive of a protest. I'm supportive of good governance, but frankly, I'm not supportive of the kind of rhetoric and action. I think it's self-serving. I think he wanted some cheap popularity. He attempted to get that through the polls, and he failed woefully. And then, unfortunately, he went out to that. And I'm sorry to say, let's look at what he publishes in his online magazine, Sahara Reporters. How credible are some of the things he publishes? All of us will agree that there are questions regarding the manner with which he carries out his journalism practice. So I'm afraid that our youth are being guided. These are influence elements within the society. And frankly, they do have other objectives that are not so obvious to you and I, that I think are not too helpful to our youth. Having said all of that, the manner, without going into the legal consequences of what has happened, as a security expert, I can speak about that and say I do not think the manner the police approached the issue was helpful. There are other manners. For example, there are questions that are asking, and I think the DSS in particular needs to clarify that. Did they get a court warrant before they went to arrest him? I'll use that word wisely, loosely, whatever. I've heard some other words being used. Was there a court warrant? If there was no court warrant, why? Why would you do that in a democratic era? So to that extent, two wrongs do not make a right. Like I said at the beginning, I do not think what he attempted to do was right, but rather I also do not think, except if the DSS had a court warrant and they've not told us, and if they haven't told us it is not right, they should have come out. The second aspect of that is what are they waiting for? Why haven't they charged him to court for whatever offense they are calling him? I think that offense, I'm not a lawyer, but calling it treasonable felony, I think it's not treason. I think it's really not appropriate.
Just very quickly, sir, before we round up this discussion, because we do have to go in a minute or two, how would you rate this government's ability or inability to tackle or curb insecurity on a scale of 1 to 10?
The fact that there are no existential threat to the country and to the government, as it were, I would rate them 8.
On a scale of 1 to 10, sir?
Yes, this is 8.
8, okay.
Well, thank you very much, Kabir Adamu. Excellent insights. Thank you very much.